Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fih, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillahi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Raise your hand if you are a child. That should be everyone in the room. Aren't you someone's child? Okay, if you're a teenager, put your hand up. Okay, those are our teens. Put them really high so we can see how many teens we have in here. Okay, college. And then, if you're an adult out of college? That's a lot of people. Okay, what about middle school and under? Okay, ooh, that was exciting, mashallah. All right, so we have a pretty good balance of individuals who are here who can give us feedback on some of the struggles that we go through. In our family life, every single one of us is gonna have some type of struggle. Sometimes it can be with our families in general, sometimes it's with parents, sometimes it's with a spouse or with a child. Let's ask those of you who are in elementary and middle school, do any of you want to share with us something that you or your friends go through that's kind of hard when it comes to your family or your friends' families? Okay, what about in school? Does anyone want to share something hard that happens in school? Okay, what if I ask you a question and then you raise your hand if you have a friend who deals with that? Does that work? Nod your head if that's okay. Okay, so if you're in middle or elementary school, how many of you sometimes get into a little bit of a fight with your parents because you want them to say okay to something and then they say no to that thing that you want? Yeah? I'm seeing yeses on that. Okay, let's go to high school. How many of you are in high school? Do any of you want to share struggles that your families go through or friends of families? Of course not. In front of the whole community, why don't you come up here and just spill your beans? All right, nod your head if you deal with issues that have to do with you wanting some type of independence or you want to do something that your family is not okay with. Yeah? Okay, that's a big one. I'm gonna go into some of the things that maybe we're not so comfortable coming up here and talking about. A lot of youth talk to me about issues of identity and trying to find who they are, and then not having their parents understand the struggles that they have to go through, and not being able to feel like they have a safe space to talk about those things. Sometimes children talk to me about feeling guilty because they have to deal with being the friend and therapist of their parents who are struggling. So sometimes parents are going through issues together in their relationship, and then through those issues, of course, they're impacting their kids. So the kids then feel like, I have to make my mom happy because she's crying because my dad said something. Or I have to help my dad because he's struggling with this and he feels so humiliated that that's something that he has to go through. So the weight of dealing with the issues that parents have are sometimes on children. Spouses talk to me about issues of uncompatibility, like when they're not compatible, or when they feel like there's a rift in between them because there's so much stress or pressure in their lives. These are typical issues. We're not even going into domestic violence, we're not going into sexual abuse, or we're going into physical or verbal abuse, but these are very common. These are just common issues that all of us struggle with that impact the way that we're able to move around in society, and they impact the way that we feel about our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As parents, a lot of you talk to me about the fear of losing your kids. As parents, nod your head if you know someone who's struggling with their children because their children don't feel like they identify with being Muslim. I'm seeing nods, yes. What about dealing with your children doing things that you're not comfortable with, finding out that they're doing it behind your back, and then not being able to confront them or confronting them and then causing an even bigger problem? Those are very common issues that our families have. Part of the reason is because we don't necessarily have training on how to be great parents and be great kids and then integrate that. We kind of expect you to just know what to do because you're Muslim and you believe, pray 5 times a day and everything's gonna be gravy. But you know, some of the people who had the most difficult relationships with their family members were actually the prophets of God. These were the people who were the closest to God. These were the most spiritual individuals, and yet they had issues. So, how many of you have siblings? Raise your hand, any age. Keep your hand up if you dealt with problems with your siblings growing up or right now. Look around the room, look around the room. How many people's hands are up? Sibling fights. Okay, Parents, raise your hand if you're a parent and you have more than one child. Okay, raise them up high. Do you ever find yourself in the middle of those arguments trying to figure out how to help your children through that? I've had parents talk to me about, I don't know what to do. They're always fighting. I'm so worried about the relationship. And we think that's very scary. But look at Adam and Eve, alayhim as-salam. Our first grandparents, way, way, way from the beginning of humanity, what did they have to deal with their own two sons? Yes, murder. It wasn't like, oh man, you're wearing my shoes, I'm gonna kill you. No, like they weren't metaphorically like, I'm gonna kill you. One killed the other one. And imagine, I want you to think about how Adam alayhi salam and Hawa alayhi salam, how did they feel in that moment? We're talking about people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created himself, who saw what Jannah was like, who knew who Allah was directly, and yet their children put them in so much pain. Think about in the progeny of Adam and Hawa. When we look at Nuh alayhi salam, so many of us struggle with having our children feel like they can identify with Islam. We see our kids do things that we don't agree with all the time. We're afraid of our kids' religion and their identity. We're worried that they're losing their language or their culture if that's what we're trying to instill amongst them. And yet, no matter what we try to tell them, they seem to be getting further and further away. And it hurts us. And so many of you spend time before Salatul Fajr and Qiyamul Layl, and you're weeping to Allah, and your head is on the ground, and you're saying, Ya Allah, guide my kids back to you. And you're begging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, please be with them. Help them realize, help them know how important it is to be with you. But then you open the Quran, and you see what Nuh alayhi salam is telling his son. He's saying, come into the ship with me. Just come in. He's not saying anything. He's not asking him for anything. He's just saying, just come in. Just come into the ship. And what's his son saying? I'm gonna go onto this mountain and it's gonna save me. I'm gonna be cool. It's just like when our kids are like, nah, man, you don't know what you're talking about. I can't relate to you. Islam's not for me. And it breaks our hearts. But imagine Nuh alayhi salam. Alayhi salam. May Allah have mercy on him and bless him. So many of us who know that pain can only imagine Nuh alayhi salam and what he had gone through. And that doesn't just have to be for children. Think about your parents. So many of you wish that your parents could also see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the same way that you might. And yet they're not willing to think about him like Ibrahim alayhi salam. Many of you have wanted to have your own space. Many of you have had beliefs that you think are the best for your life. And you're excited about telling your mom and dad, I want to study this major. I've had a revelation. This is who I want to marry. And their response is, no, you're crazy. That's not how I raised you. I don't agree with that. And how do you think Ibrahim alayhi salam felt when what he is telling his father and he's telling his people is to worship God alone, and he's being rejected by his own family? What we're struggling with in our families isn't necessarily because we don't have a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, that's the most important thing to keep us going. But the best of the best also struggled. Many of you come from blended families where you may have a stepfather or stepmother or step-siblings. You may have been divorced and remarried. In so many of your family lives, there may be times where you're trying to work through those relationships. Think about Musa alayhi salam. Was Musa alayhi salam a stepchild? He wasn't? Yeah, he was. Good job, Adnan. Musa alayhi salam had a stepdad. And this is not by any means. Step families, may Allah bless them, beautiful. I just want to give you an example of one that was difficult to deal with. But even in that difficulty, even in the fact that he had to go back to someone who raised him who was tyrannical, and of course, if we have tyrants in our community, not in step families, just in general, we need to seek professional help. It's not enough to just say, I'm going to make dhikr and everything's going to be better. Make dhikr, but also seek professional help. It's so important for our families to have therapy and to have support. But look at Musa alayhi salam. Despite the fact that he was raised in this palace by this man and this woman alayhi salam, despite all of that, he was still told to come back and speak gently to his father. Now, We're not talking about you speaking gently to someone who's abusing you, God forbid. But we're just looking at the reality that the prophets themselves had to deal with the struggles that we deal with. And when we look at Asiya alayhi salam, how many of you know people who are struggling in their marriages? Someone who you thought was going to be your hero, someone who you thought was going to be the one who was going to be there for you, who's going to be your best friend or your companion, then ends up abusing you. And that's real in our families. And that's Fir'aun to Asiya alayhi salam. Now, of course, we know that she was killed by his order, and we know that the way that she went was worshiping Allah and asking to be next to him. But we can't allow in our own communities for it to get to that point. We need to be individuals who are agents of support, who are helping our families heal from the pain that we have, and helping provide services like Sister Malika does, and other individuals to help provide that space of safety. But the reality is that the best of the best had to deal with the same struggles that we're dealing with. We're looking at individuals who not only sacrificed their lives and their livelihood for the sake of God, but they sacrificed their families as well. And we're going to take from the example of one of those people, someone who struggled with their identity, someone who struggled with depression, somebody who struggled with abuse, with verbal abuse, physical abuse, someone who lost their family members. We're going to talk about how through all of that difficulty, this person still had light. This person still had a nur. And how through that light, despite the hardship that they went through, that light is communicated to us for us to have something to hold on to regardless of the pain that we're going through. Who do you think I'm about to tell you about? Yes, the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, alaihi. The Prophet Sallallahu, alaihi, like many of you, knew who he was to some degree. You may be able to introduce yourself and say, I'm a student at this school, I study this, I like doing these things, I'm an amazing soccer player. You may have certain qualities about yourself that you identify with and that other people know you about. That's how they recognize you. And that's like the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, alaihi. He knew he was a father, he was a husband, he was involved in certain business and trade. He knew that he was somebody who the people referred to as truthful. Now, in the midst of this, in knowing who he is, he's still seeking something. And then all of a sudden, he's given revelation. Now, I want you to think about times when you've had a revelation in your life, or when your child has had a revelation in their lives. Mom and Dad, I need to talk to you about something. And you come together, and many of you may have gone through this before you got married 20 or 30 years ago. And you went to your family and you said, this is the person I want to marry. I've had a revelation. This is my mate. I've had a revelation. This is the person that I'm supposed to be with for the rest of my life. And the reaction that your family might have had is, no, you're wrong. I've been the one to raise you. You're going to study what I think is best for you. Imagine if the Prophet ﷺ went to Khadija and then she said, you're wrong. What would that have done to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? And what would that have done for their relationship? Not just for him as a person, but for their relationship as well. He went to Khadija radiallahu anha, and what he said is, what is wrong with me? What did Khadija radiallahu anha say back? Yes, she comforted him. Yes. Forsake you. Mm-hmm. There you go. Waraqa. Mm-hmm. That's an excellent example of them. With that love. Mm-hmm. And the first thing that you said was because of his character. And sometimes when someone comes up to us, one of our own children, a lot of youth tell me, I know that I'm not going to do something wrong, but my parents don't trust me. It's not you, it's the world around you, which I'm sure many of you have heard. But they know that they wouldn't do something that would displease their families, and yet they still feel like their parents are not willing to believe them. Khadija radiallahu anha, she said, God would never abandon you. And then she tied it specifically to the fact that he was helping other people, the fact that he's truthful, the fact that he hosts individuals, that he stands up for the poor, that he stands up for those who are dealing with injustice. And we're going to look at what that means for us. So she's telling him, number one, God would never forsake you. What does that mean in our families, in our relationships? Let's look at what the Prophet ﷺ dealt with and why that applies to us. So of course the Prophet ﷺ, he then, after sharing the news of Islam, was rejected by his own family. He was then abused by his own family. Eventually there was a boycott in which his own family suffered. Now, I want you to think about a time where maybe you had to move your entire family to another city because of a new job. How many of you know someone who's had to go through that? Okay, maybe it's a great opportunity. Maybe it's just the opportunity that you have to take. But you're maybe worried about what's going to happen to your family. Are they going to adjust easily? Are they going to make new friends? What's the community going to be like? Of course you're worried. And sometimes the reason you're going through that is only because of your decision. Of course you make it as a family decision, hopefully, but at the end of the day, it's something that you feel like is best for all of you. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, people are suffering, are being persecuted, are dying, are not being given food and easy access to resources through the boycott because of him, ﷺ. Not just because of him, because of a message that he's delivering to the people. Of course he believes in what he's sharing. And of course, the people he don't even necessarily believe but are supporting him. But imagine what he felt like when he's seeing his own family members struggle, when he's seeing children who are suffering. Now, he's going through this. And who is affected deeply by this? Who is affected so much by this? It's Khadija radiallahu anha. So the one who supported him in the most difficult time in his life is now dying, and she passes away, radiyallahu anha. And any of you who has lost someone who you love, any one of you who has lost a loved one knows that pain. And if you've lost a spouse, you know that pain in a different way than anyone else could imagine. He experienced her loss. And then who did he experience as well? Yes, Abu Talib. He then experienced the loss of his uncle. Now, this is the one person who's been supporting him since the time he was a child, who's been with him. Any of you who have an older family member, a grandfather, a great uncle, who's been with you, who's been supportive of you, who's loved you, who's taken care of you like their own child. If you've lost that person, you know that pain. You know how painful that is. May Allah bless you and protect you. You know how hard that is. The Prophet ﷺ just lost his spouse, and he's losing Abu Talib. Now this is painful because we know the pain of loss, not just of death, but also loss of identity, loss of support. He loses everything at once. And then, in order to seek some sort of opportunity, the Prophet ﷺ goes to Ta'if. And he's hoping through going through Ta'if, he's maybe able to find different type of support. Maybe by going there, he's going to find people who are supportive and who believe in him. But we know what happened there. He wasn't just rejected, he was humiliated. And all of us have likely experienced both of those feelings. Times when people haven't accepted us, have excluded us because of our race, because of our class. There have been times when someone's not willing to accept us or consider us for marriage simply because of our background. Many of us have experienced these types of feelings. But the Prophet ﷺ, in the midst of his pain of losing his wife and his best supporter, in the midst of his pain of losing his uncle, and the number one individual who would stand up for him towards the Quraysh, he goes to Ta'if, he's rejected. And then what happens? He's in loss, he's in loss, he's in loss. He's in darkness after darkness. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of his mercy, to provide an incredible light, not only into his life, but into ours as well, he takes him up to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. He goes to Jerusalem and he meets the same people who had family issues just like he had. He goes to Al-Aqsa and he meets brothers, his own brothers, who struggled like he struggled, who lost, like Nuh alayhi salam, his own son, who lost his family members without them believing. And then what happens when he's taken up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He's given a gift from Allah. He's given salah. Now, salah is coming after pain, pain, pain. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides him. Like Adil Salah, he talks about Muhammad, man and messenger. He provides him with a gift. Salah was a gift for the Prophet ﷺ to consistently feel that comfort, to consistently feel that support, to consistently feel that light from An-Nur, from the light himself. And that gift is for us as well. If we pray, we're not saying that praying 5 times a day is going to make your family problems go away. I want you to look at salah kind of like a cell phone. Think about the person you love most in your life. Do you have that person in mind? Someone you really, really love? If you can't think of anyone, think of who you want it to be, hypothetically. So you have that person in mind, and they're like, look, here's my cell. You can call me any time of day or night. I'm gonna be here for you. Prepaid card, you don't have to pay the bill. Just reach out to me and I'm here. Anytime you go through something, you know you can count on them. You know you can call them when you got in a fight with your spouse. You know you can call them when your siblings are going crazy over each other. You know that you can call them when your children are crying and you don't know what to do. You know that you can call them. But if you call them, does that necessarily mean that that situation is just going to be resolved on its own? Nah. But they'll be able to give you advice. They'll be able to give you support. And that's like salah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, has power over every situation. And He can make everything better. But He's asking us to also go through the process and put in the work. But He's there just like that favorite person of yours is there. Salah is a light for our lives, and it was given to the Prophet ﷺ in the hardest time of his life. Reflecting on his life, later on he said the hardest time was Ta'if for him. Now this is the hardest experience he's had after losing the most important people in his life, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him a light that's going to continue for us. And that's why Khadija radiallahu anha told him that God will never forsake you. Because even in the hardest times in our own families, He reminds us that even though we see salah as a burden, salah is a light, is a lifeline for us to keep going despite that hardship. When you go into sujood, when it's qiyam, and you're begging Allah to keep your kids on the right path. When you go into sujood, and it's Jum'ah, and everyone around you has something else going on in their lives, but you know that you can't move forward without His help, it's a light in your life. Regardless of the issues that we're going through with our families, we need to remember what Khadija radiallahu anha told the Prophet ﷺ when he was struggling not only with identity, but also with depression. He thought he went crazy. And that's a very scary thought, especially for someone like the Prophet ﷺ. And then revelation stopped and he was so sad. He went through depression like we go through that sadness and that grief. But it's okay for us to go through those things, especially when we have a lifeline. And the second thing that Khadija radiallahu anha tied that connection to was the fact that he was somebody who helped other people. So she talked to him, reminded him about the way that he helps the poor, about the fact that he's truthful, the way that he hosts people and stands up against injustice. So for us as well, studies have shown that individuals who are involved with generativity, which means unselfish care. That means that you're willing to give love to someone. When you open the door to someone who's standing behind you just because you want to do that something polite or help them out because they're holding bags, that's an unselfish act of love. When you help your child with their work, or you stay up at night and keep them when they're crying, that's unselfish love. When you call a parent just because you know they're lonely, that's unselfish love. When you hold a friend when they're crying because they've gone through something difficult, that is unselfish love. Every single one of you has experienced this concept of generativity or giving back to someone unselfishly, being there to love them. When you engage in that, like the Prophet ﷺ did, studies have found it affects you in 2 different ways. The first one is success materially. There is longevity in your life. Individuals who practice generativity usually get higher grades. Sometimes it's directly linked to their finances. You are immediately impacted in the way that you help other people. And who better to help than your own family, even if it's difficult and you're struggling. The second part when it comes to generativity is you're affected spiritually. So studies have found that people who are generative what they do is they eventually identify as someone who's more religious or spiritual. So when you help other people, studies have actually found that you then reconnect with God. And what that means is Khadija radiallahu anha, when she's tying the fact that the Prophet ﷺ is helping other people to the fact that God will not forsake him, it means that us, when we're going through hardship with our families, when we don't know how to deal with our in-laws, when we're struggling with the pain that we feel and we don't know who to turn to, when we help other people anyway, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never gonna forsake us and he will always be with us. Remember that it's very difficult for every single one of us going through our family struggles. We're not touching on the deep things right now, which inshallah I hope we'll talk about in the panel. But all of us have our own baggage that we're embarrassed to share in front of others or that we're struggling with on our own. That is something that unites us. But like the pain, there is also light. The Prophet ﷺ dealt with greater pain than any of us can deal with in one lifetime. He lost every single one of his children, from infancy to adulthood, except for Fatima radiallahu anha, in his lifetime. And yet he said, "Arihna biha ya Bilal," when he talked about salah. Let it be something that gives us rest. Let it be something that brings coolness to us. Because an-nur gave us a nur to connect with him. And when we connect with him through salah, inshallah, God willing, it's something that can encourage us to help others again. And through that help, we'll be reconnected with him as well. So remember, when we're struggling, it's natural, it's common, it's very normal. But he is always there as a lifeline to both help you and to listen. A safe space that will never judge you, who will always respond to you. And also remember that it's okay to seek help. It's important to seek help. And helping others, inshallah, will not only be something that will help yourself, but will bring you back to him subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now, inshallah, what we're going to do is we're going to go into a Q&A session where hopefully we can actually talk about the real issues that you struggle with in your families and actually hear from people who work consistently with family issues. Let's just, inshallah, take a moment to reflect on the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused the greatest of the great to go through the same problems that we're going through. And that's because he knew that's going to be a reality for us. So he wanted us to have examples of people who are going to go through the same things. We can make it, inshallah, as they did. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honor us with meeting them in Firdaus al-A'la together. Assalamu alaikum.